confused, you've missed the last 2 weeks, you need to go back to our YouTube page and see how that story has unfolded with our friend, the video bumper. We're wrapping up this series today. If you're just joining us for the last couple of weeks, it's the end of the movie. We're talking about dating, strings attached. We kind of shared how that phrase came to be known in the trade world of fabric and what that means in our culture and what we think we want in relationships, what we think we want in dating, what realities there are, that strings are very much attached to relationships and companionship. We think we can do this without expecting anything in return, but the reality is we all expect something in return. We're all doing something, hoping, praying, expecting something to come back toward us in this world of companionship. And so we started off by talking about the massive issue in dating is one of the massive issues, but I think one of the primary issues in dating is that people are looking for fulfillment and satisfaction in a relationship, in companionship, in dating. They're looking to be fulfilled or they're looking to satisfy a desire, and that's just not possible because there's not a single person on this planet that was created to satisfy or fulfill you other than Jesus Christ. That is the only relationship, the only person that can do that for us. Now, the same is true in marriage. We talked specifically to single people last week. We're going to talk specifically to married people this week. That doesn't mean there's nothing for us all to learn if you're single or single again. But I'm going to take some time today to talk a little bit of the ins and outs and how dating relates to marriage and that kind of thing. But the truth is that many people in their own marriages are looking for fulfillment and satisfaction in each other. Some people are even looking for repair in their significant other. When I was in college, the movie Jerry Maguire came out, and the whole "You Complete Me" thing was a big deal, which I thought was awesome. And I said it to Anita, and all the girls in my college at the time were reading this book called Lady in Waiting, which I still hate to this day because it made all of them not want to date us. And she was like, "I don't complete you. You need to be complete in Christ." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know the churchy answer." But you know what I'm trying to say here, emotionally and romantically. And anyway, it was really sweet because later on in my wedding ring, she had engraved "You Complete Me" in mine, so it meant like a big, huge deal. And it was cool. Yeah. Aw. She's not here today. Our youngest has an ear infection, so she's dealing with that. We had about 2 hours of sleep last night. So pray for him, pray for Declan. But even I and many people like me have looked to, okay, if I can just find that person and get married, then I'm going to figure things out. I'm going to feel like I've arrived, or I'm going to feel like I'm not so insecure, or whatever it is. And the reality is that's not true. And too many times, we are trying to pattern. We're trying to take our marriage and fit Jesus into it. But the reality is this, that marriage is patterned after Christ's commitment to his church. Not the other way around, not his church's commitment to him. And so when we think about marriage, when we think about dating, when you think about your spouse, if you're married, you need to think about it through the context, through the lens of how Jesus relates to his bride, the church. And the stakes certainly go up in that case. But the question for us today is, what does it look like to date in a marriage, right? Because I'm not going to sit here and tell you, like, gentlemen, you need to take your wife on a weekly date night, because if you don't love her and you don't love Jesus, right? That's not a reality for a lot of us. It's not possible. I don't get that opportunity. You know, if you have a kid, then the schedule gets crazy. If you have multiple kids, the schedule is insane. I know many people are trying to make sacrifices to go to small group. They're trying to make sacrifices to have time together. It's just difficult. And so making a blanket statement like you got to go on a date night every week it's just unfair, honestly. But I think a better question to ask is not what does it look like, what does dating look like in marriage, but what is the purpose of dating in marriage? What is the purpose of dating in marriage? And I believe there are two clear purposes for continuing to date your spouse. The first of those is refreshment. And when you have refreshment, when you go on dating, it refreshes you. You have relief from your daily schedule. You have relief from your parenting duties. You have relief from all else that's going on. You can focus on that primary relationship, that marriage. So you have refreshment and relief in that, but you also have inspiration. I remember a date that Anita and I went on. This is before Declan was born. We had a couple of miscarriages, and we thought maybe that part of our world was done, that God had allowed us to have some kids, and now that was just the reality for us, and it was hard. And so we were on a date, and we were in Olive Garden, and we were talking about the possibility of adoption one day. And at some point in the conversation, we're just sitting there weeping, just like ugly crying into our lasagna fritta and breadsticks. And I'm sure that everyone else around that restaurant that day thought, oh my gosh, they're getting a divorce, right? Like, how terrible, I can't believe I have to lie. And really, we were just like praying and asking God and trusting him, and he was inspiring us to ask the question, God, what do you want for us? What do you want from us as parents? What do you want from us as people? And so refreshment in dating for marriages can provide relief and inspiration. The other thing is reminder. And I don't know about you gentlemen, but I oftentimes need this. I need the reminder of why I pursued this relationship and what this relationship means in my life. It's the why you did and why you are. It's the reminder of why I did and why I am moving forward in this relationship. And so that's the purpose, I think, two very clear purposes in marriage. And so I'm going to read in Proverbs chapter 5, this section of verses here that I think are important for us, because what Solomon, who is the wisest man who's ever lived, he spends some time in the book of Proverbs, a lot of time talking about marriages, husbands and wives, but he spends a lot of time because he's instructing his son on how to live. And so he takes a lot of time to warn his son against adultery, against being distracted, against going down the wrong path, chasing after the wrong things. And in chapter 5, in verse 15 and following, this is what Solomon's saying to his son in reference to his son's wife. Now remember, Solomon had a billion wives, okay? And it wasn't a good thing. He saw the best and the worst, I believe, in marriage. He did it to an extreme. But this is what he says in chapter 5, verse 15 to his son. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets? Let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe, let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. That should be like a memory verse for every married man on planet Earth, right there. Like, that's a great one to remember. So if you're not good at memory verse, that's just a good place to start, I'll just say. All right, verse 20. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? For a man's ways are before the Lord, before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. The iniquity of the wicked ensnare him, and he is held fast in the cords of his sin. He dies for lack of discipline, and because of his great folly, he is led astray. Now, the question I ask when I read this is, what is the connection between drink from your own cisterns and marriage? And he's saying that one of the biggest difficulties for husbands is the desire factor, and that we're thirsty, right? That's a phrase the young people use in the dating world, isn't it? You thirsty, right? I'm not really sure what it means. It's probably inappropriate, so I'm using it in a bad way, I guess. But that's a reality for us. Like, most men, I would say 95% of men, struggle with lust or pornography, and the other 5% are lying about it, pretty much is how that works. I've shared with you my own struggle with that. That's like kind of been my biggest hurdle in pursuing Jesus, has been that in my life. We have accountability software, all those kind of things. We've set things up so that's not as big a concern in our world anymore, but it's always something that I have to be on guard against, because that's the reality. And Solomon, even back then, is saying, son, you're going to be tempted. You're going to be tempted and distracted from the wife that God has given you. You need to drink from your own cistern. There are a few things more detrimental to your wife's heart and soul. And listen to me, guys. I'm not preaching at you. I'm preaching with you. This is stuff that I have to absorb. But there are few things more detrimental to your wife's heart and soul than a husband seeking out through other relationships the things that your marriage is supposed to give to you. And I mean as innocent as a comment about the way somebody cooked the food your wife cooks, right? Like, this is the best spaghetti I've ever had. All of a sudden, your wife is thinking, what's wrong with my spaghetti? And it's silly and humorous, but it's true, isn't it? Like there's this balance, this hurt that happens. And when it crosses over the line into this sexual, physical realm, even if it's pornography, even if it's just a television show or an actress, like you have to be careful. We used to joke back in early days of our marriage about our movie star girlfriend and movie star boyfriend or celebrity crushes and that kind of thing. But I realize that hurts my wife's heart when I talk about other women in the context, even in an imaginary fantasy world that's harmful to her. Because I'm supposed to be drinking from my own cistern. God has provided this wonderful, overflowing stream of grace and beauty in my life. That's where I should seek out. And so Solomon says, rejoice in the wife of your youth. Are you rejoicing in your wife, gentlemen? Like husbands, are you rejoicing in your wife? Are you celebrating her? Are you still grateful that someone against better judgment said yes to spending their life with you? Because I've met some of you guys. There's no reason they should have said yes. Like me, I gave her every reason not to, and she did anyway. Are you rejoicing in her? Because you're supposed to be. And likewise, wives have an opportunity to be life-giving to their husbands. You do. I don't know that women understand the great power that God has granted you in the life of your husband. You could just flip this masculine, feminine language here and apply it to women as well. As a matter of fact, I'll go so far to say this, that the booming demographic for the pornography industry is not men. It's women. And you say, oh, that's just not the way women are. Men are physical. That's the way. We're more romantic and intuition. Really? Okay, how about 50 Shades of Grey and Magic Mike? You telling me just all the guys are going to see those? I'm not. I got to look at myself in the mirror. I don't need to see that and feel worse about myself. Ladies, this is a pitfall potentially for you as well. But this amazing opportunity you've been given. Solomon, the wisest man who's ever lived, and I'm going to try to push through this stuff fast today, and you can go back and watch it or not watch it or tune out and scroll on Facebook if you like. But Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, spoke so often about the power of a wife in a husband's life. He listed several times the negatives, and he listed several times the positives. But you can ask the same question, wives. Are you rejoicing in your husband? Are you gassing him up? Do you know what that means, over a 30 crowd? Because some of you are like, did we give him extra carbs? What does that mean? I don't gassing him up. No, it's a term that means you're putting him on blast, like you are out there like, look at my mans. Look at him. Like social media, I know we don't act like we care, but oh my word, we care. I was just looking back through social media last night, as a matter of fact, and saw a post from my wife about me. And I mean, just there was this confidence, this inspiration that doesn't come from any other source in the world. Yet if you look at media and television and movies, most of the time, men are the butt of the joke. Husbands are the silly goof, and the wives are the wisecracking, sarcastic, critical voice in the home. And do you know how that happened? It didn't happen out of imagination. It happened out of the shift in our conversation in the homes. It happened because women started standing up for themselves, which they should have, and they shouldn't have to stand up for themselves. They should be taken care of and guarded and treasured. But as our culture shifted, men weren't being men. Women started to usurp these kind of authoritative pictures in our culture and started to abuse them. And I'm not saying that you can't talk in a joking manner. I'm not saying you don't have a voice in your homes, ladies, but there is a blessing that you have in the life of a man that no one else has. And Solomon warns about the negative impacts of a wife. And he warns about, he celebrates the positive impacts that a wife can have in a husband. In Proverbs chapter 12, verse 4, he says, an excellent wife is the crown of her husband. Like she is the crown. I've said oftentimes that when God was making everything, and yes, I believe that God made everything in the creation story, that the last stroke on the masterpiece of creation, the cherry on top, was when he made woman. And I'm so glad he did. And in the life of a marriage, a wife is the crown of her husband. In Proverbs 18:22, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. In Proverbs 19:14, house and wealth are inherited from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. Proverbs 31:10, an excellent wife, who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. This is incredible. I want you, ladies, to understand the value that you bring to your homes, the value that you bring to your marketplaces, the value you bring to all these different areas of your life. But none of them are as valuable, according to God, as the value you bring to your marriage. But on the flip side, there's great danger. Solomon warns at the other side of Proverbs 12:4, he says, but she who brings shame is like a rottenness in his bones. Proverbs 19:13, a foolish son is ruin to his father, and a wife's quarreling is a continual dripping of rain. Folks, I think we know what the continual dripping of rain feels like. We've had that for several months. I don't think any woman wants to feel like she's that. Proverbs 21:9, it's better to live in a corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a quarrelsome wife. It's better to sit on the edge of the roof and live there than to have a quarrelsome wife. He says it again in Proverbs 25:4. It's better to live in the corner of the housetop than in the house shared with a quarrelsome wife. And then Proverbs 27:15, a continual dripping on a rainy day and a quarrelsome wife are alike. And here is where the strings become incredibly difficult to cut. Because in marriage, there's this tension where a man thinks, well, if I do everything I'm supposed to do and she doesn't, what then? Far too often a woman does far more than she is supposed to do and doesn't have anything in return. And we think, well, how long do I tolerate that? What if I do everything that God tells me to and it's not reciprocated? What do I do? And then when we think about those things, when we say those words, it's clear that the strings are attached in that relationship and that marriage. But this is true, that true intimacy is impossible when strings are attached. It's impossible. You cannot experience the greatest, the deepest, most precious level of intimacy with your spouse if you're still waiting for something in return. Gentlemen, don't wash the dishes and vacuum the rugs because you're hoping to get lucky that night. Do it because it needs to be done and you love your wife. If you're overtly or subtly waiting to get something out of your marriage, you're actually sabotaging it. The reality is this: only liars make vows. If you've been married, if you are married, you stood in front of a group of people or in front of a stranger, justice of the peace on some island somewhere in a courtroom, or whatever your story is. You stood and you made promises that you can't keep and you haven't kept. At some level, whether physically, mentally, emotionally, we all break those vows. Yet some of us decide that at some point that they've broken them worse than us. And so they're worse than us. When we're both liars, you have to decide that you're going to give your absolute best to your marriage for God's glory. For God's glory. Ephesians 5:22 gives instructions for wives on how to live in regards to their husbands. It says, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. That's caused a great deal of controversy, but that is immediately following a verse that talks about mutual submission, both people submitting to each other for the greatness of God's glory. That's the instruction. And it's not submit to your husbands or else. It's for the sake of God's glory, submit to him. Honor him. Respect him is a better word for me. And then in verse 25 in that same chapter, Paul gives instructions to men. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Lay down your life, lay down your hobbies, lay down your golf schedule, lay down your work schedule, lay down your watching the national championship tonight and watching Notre Dame win over Baylor in the women's game. That was just my little plug, sorry. Lay down everything, your life, everything. Well, she doesn't even seem interested in our physical relationship anymore. Lay it down. That's exactly what Christ did for you. If you want your marriage to be different, which I think all of us do, even those of us who have a healthy, vibrant marriage, we want it to be better. We want it to improve. We want it to glorify God. We want it to benefit those who are involved. But this is the reality that my friend Travis Agnew is a pastor in Greenville area. He said this, my marriage cannot change if I stay the same. My marriage cannot change if I stay the same. My marriage can't get better if I'm not working to make it better. My marriage can't survive if I'm not working for its survival. If I'm waiting on the other person to fulfill the strings attached, my marriage isn't going to change. It's going to crumble. And I think the question comes oftentimes, and let me be very sensitive to this, because I know there are very, very difficult circumstances that maybe some of you are in, some of you have been in, and you're starting to think, well, what about abuse and physical and emotional and sexual and all those different things? There are so many multi-layers to these conversations that we can't make a blanket statement to it all. And so please don't hear me as some conservative pastor who's like, you got to give everything to Jesus and bear it and grin it and what. I don't want you to think I'm not sensitive to those issues. But I heard Andy Stanley say this one time in a difficult circumstance, in a marriage context. He says, you're free to walk out on your spouse the moment Jesus walks out on his. I don't know what's going on in your marriage, but I'm quite sure that neither of you have nailed the other to a cross, denied, betrayed, spit, sinned against the other. Yet Jesus looks at his bride, the church, and lays his life down for her and loves her and freely accepts her. What does it look like in the context of marriage to date your spouse? What does it mean? Well, I think it can be simple. The question that we need to ask ourselves, husbands and wives, is what are you doing that is life-giving for your spouse? What are you doing that brings life? Because some guys, we need to be gassed up. We need our wives to brag on us a little bit. We do. We're just emotionally brittle, egocentric guys, and we need some fluffing up. Gentlemen, there's some ladies here that they just need to see that you notice and you care what's going on around the house. They need you to pick up the burden a little bit. That would give life to them. And you need to find what that is. Men, prioritize time with your wife. You need to wow and woo her. You remember when we did that stuff before we got married? I got a box. This is how dumb we were back in the 90s. I printed out all the emails that we wrote to each other so that we could save them and have them one day because I didn't know how the internet worked. I literally have a box that has a stack of emails that Anita and I wrote back and forth. And I've got these pictures and poems and all this stuff. I'm like, where did that go? How am I wowing her? How am I wooing her? Because this sure ain't doing it anymore. I used to be like 5% body fat, man. But gentlemen, how are you wowing and wooing your wife? Are you prioritizing time with her? Women, wives, are you gassing your husband up? Are you bragging on him to others and to him? I mean, you want to see your husband smile? You walk in and like, dang, baby, you looking good today. Look at you. Look at you with your Dockers. Gas him up. Brag on him. Tell him you still love him. You still want to be with him. And for all of us, we've got to remember, and I'm wrapping up now. We have to remember that the foundational element of relationships and companionship is that Jesus offered us his love with no strings attached. Well, let me back up. There were strings attached, but there were only strings that he could fulfill. Not us, only him. So wherever you are in the romance and dating conversation, I want you to go right back to that. Whether you're married, you're single again. Jesus, foundational. He did it all for us. His example, his glory is what it's all about. How are we living our lives to bring God glory in every area of our hearts and lives?